For RCR Tech, I'm Sean Kinney, and welcome to Signal and Noise, where we host conversations from the edge of AI with a range of industry experts and thought leaders. We're joined today by David Nicholson, who wears a number of professional hats. I'd encourage you to check out the work he does for Futurum Research and for 65 Media, and follow him on LinkedIn, which is where I'm drawing from for the framing of today's discussion. So, David, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here, Sean. Good to meet you.
Well, so you recently published an article on LinkedIn that I thought was really thought-provoking, which prompted me to reach out. The title of that was Is Artificial Intelligence Worthy of a Manhattan Project-like effort, or is it a bad excuse for
Yeah.
overreach? You raised a ton of interesting points in the article that I'd like to kind of unpack, but first, what motivated you to write this, and why now? Was there a particular impetus, or was it just a number of thoughts kind of coalescing?
Yeah, this has been something that's been a discussion among my students in the executive education program courses at Wharton that I teach. And I think that kind of the tipping point was the rumors around the idea that the US government would be, quote, taking a stake in Intel, unquote. I think it's a bit ironic that people started hand wringing and freaking out about this when in the previous administration, billions and billions and billions of dollars were committed through the CHIPS Act. And if people were so naive as to think that when the government gives you money, there are no strings attached, then they're quite naive. So this has been something that has been going on, frankly, forever. And I think what prompted me to sort of explore this question was those rumors specifically around Intel. And now we know a little more about where those rumors were going to lead.
Yep, you called it exactly right. There are no free rides and a 10% stake. So a very material sort of infusion of cash for Intel. And I think upstream of that, though, I want to like look at the global competitive dynamic that you see and maybe kind of define the map a little bit here. So just going
Yeah.
to quote from your article briefly, because you said it so succinctly. The finish line will define global power for decades. The question we should be asking isn't whether to involve the government in AI, but whether we're prepared to treat it like the next Manhattan Project because our competitors already are. Not to be reductive here, but this is kind of a US-China race, right? To AI supremacy or AGI or whatever you'd like to characterize the next end state as, I guess. So set the stage for us. I think it's
Yeah.
fair to acknowledge that China's government can align the private sector in a way that you do not see happening in the West. But to your point about the US government taking a stake in Intel, certainly not the same thing, but it is similar in some ways. But, what do you see as the competitive advantages the US has, the competitive advantage that China has?
Yeah. I think, like many things in life, the right answer is somewhere in the middle of two polar extremes. My educational background, many, many, many decades ago, was in economics. I've been in tech for, 35 years, but I still use that lens, the sort of economist lens, to look at these things. And if you take the kind of stereotypical view of the world that China has a communist government, the United States has a free, God bless America government, and that we have a private sector that runs things, whereas China has a central planned CCP guided economy. Each of those is kind of a false narrative because the reality is somewhere in between. And I think the success that China has enjoyed for the last couple of decades, at least, has been the realization by the Chinese Communist Party that they have to unshackle capitalism and free enterprise. And if they can manage it and assist it, that the combination of that central control with a thriving private sector economy can be very, very powerful. On the other hand, in the US, we've pretended to have, I think, more of a laissez-faire, hands-off approach with the private sector. But the reality is more indicated by something like the CHIPS Act. The so-called stake in Intel that the US government owns now, it's the money that we were giving them from the CHIPS Act. It's just that we're now overtly saying that the people of the United States own a stake in this company now, as opposed to, frankly, the kind of backroom, shadowy dispersal of 10 plus billion with all sorts of strings attached that might only benefit a few privileged people. So while the editorials are roundly against this and saying that it is un-American in the US, the irony is the amount of money that's being given to Intel hasn't changed. It's just, and the strings that are attached, those have changed. I would argue that the strings that were attached with CHIPS Act funding were more onerous. They actually slowed down the development of plants in Ohio, as an example, in a way. So the backdrop is absolutely the tension between East and West. I see the US now looking at what is working in China, taking a page out of what I would say is, frankly, the US Constitution. Look at the preamble. What is the role of the federal government? Provide for the common defense, support general welfare. You could argue that AI is sort of an infrastructure thing, like roads and bridges. It's also a security thing, like the military. You could argue, and I am arguing it right now, that to a certain degree, it makes sense for the federal government to jump in and have a hand in this because only a federal government sized entity can provide the resources necessary to make these advances, especially when on the other side of the ocean you have China that seems to be a little bit better positioned in this regard.
Yeah, so to maybe play that back to you and get you to expand on a little bit, do you see, I mean, China's done a good job of incentivizing the private sector in a way that looks like capitalism while retaining a degree of centralized planning in pursuit of, X, whatever the ambition is. Do you think what we've seen with Intel is a move in the right direction? Is it a move towards that middle path that you described where, we are making explicit that yes, there are strings attached to this money and expectations will flow from that?
Yeah, I think it's a conversation starter because as a case study, I think that a lot of US companies would argue that the money going to Intel, that's throwing good money after bad. There are companies that would argue that Intel lost its way, fell behind, and that they should be left to to the results of their own behavior. And they would point out that these companies would point out that they have engaged with TSMC for things and they've turned their backs on Intel because of quality, because of the product. And so, the good old American way is if you solve a business problem for someone, you'll get rich doing it. Fantastic. But if you're not solving people's business problems, the government shouldn't step in to prop you up. Now, if you accept that domestic production of semiconductors is critical to the national interest, that's where the conversation changes a bit. So I think the only way you can justify the Intel specific investment is under that banner. A real public-private partnership that would be more Manhattan Project like would be something like the agreement with NVIDIA, where we say, okay, NVIDIA, you, as we, the federal government, I'm not in the federal government, but the US says, okay, we're going to ease export restrictions, but you're going to pay essentially a tax in order to access markets in China. You will benefit as a private company, but the interest of the country is at least as important. Ideally, we use those funds to subsidize other efforts that are critical from a national interest perspective. So Intel, not a great case study. Not sure where this is going to head. The proof of the pudding from an Intel perspective will have nothing to do with how much money is dispersed by the government, what the ownership terms look like. The only thing that will matter will be Intel's foundry business landing one or more significant customers who decide, independent of this funding, that they think Intel is the right partner for the production of the semiconductors that they want. That will gauge, forget about all the political noise in the background, talk about signal and noise, forget about all that noise. The only thing that will matter will be in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months, does Intel start landing some customers for its foundry business that aren't Intel? right? It's not okay to just say, well, Intel's buying a lot of stuff from Intel's newly formed foundry business. No, it's got to be something like, a marquee customer, somebody like an Apple who says, hey, we're signing this multi-billion dollar, multi-year contract because we believe in Intel's foundry business, regardless of who owns the company.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an important point here. You referenced TSMC. If we strip away everything else and we agree that the infrastructure needed to do AI at scale and to lead in AI is critical to our country's best interest, then there needs to be diversification in fabrication capacity for leading edge semis. And right now there is not. So, I mean, this seems like an imperative any way you slice it and whatever your sort of political bent is.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. And I think that you can look at it from the supply chain perspective, but supply chains are really complicated today. It's not as simple as country A manufactures something and sells it to country B. There are all sorts of intermediaries. We are a global economy. We can't just completely retreat behind our borders. But I think that the pandemic showed us that there are really good reasons to have certain levels of domestic supply chain, friendly supply chain available. One thing I want to introduce to this kind of idea of what a Manhattan Project means, it's not just the hardware and software that is being developed. So it's not just how advanced is the latest model and or how advanced is the latest hardware that model leverages. I would use an analogy. I'm not a snowboarder. I'm not even a downhill skier, but I've always been struck by this idea that the guy who invented the snowboard never won a gold medal in the Olympics or the X Games in snowboarding. And it's an important thing to remember. Just because NVIDIA builds all of these GPUs and this entire stack of hardware and software, just because OpenAI and Anthropic and others are building these models, the real value is going to be unlocked by clever people who are going to figure out how to answer the question that I toss out, which is AI, ROI, WTF, question mark. And we haven't answered that question yet, especially on the generative side. There's an MIT study that a lot of people have referenced recently that said, 95% of businesses are saying they're getting no value from generative AI. There are a lot of flaws with the way they did that study, but there's some truth there. And the truth is that a lot of people are trying to figure out where state-of-the-art generative AI fits today. We talk about the bubble. Are we in a bubble? Of course, we're in a bubble from a financial perspective. You can't argue that we're not. But that's different than asking the question pre-dot-com bubble versus today. Is there more e-commerce today? Is there more internet today? Has the internet revolutionized and changed our lives? Of course it has. And I believe AI will absolutely do that. Will there be? I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for the first Theranos of AI, frankly. I'm waiting for the biggest AI scandal to hit, the $1 trillion scandal. And it's coming. Trust me, it's coming. I don't know who's going to be involved, but we're going to see that. But that doesn't mean that AI isn't critically important and worthy of this public-private kind of partnership thing. But so that would be the third leg if you want to come up with a three-legged stool analogy. Call it hardware, software, and then how to use it, what to do with it. There's a gold rush there. Those are all the global systems integrators, large and small, who are trying to help people figure out how to get positive ROI out of this stuff. Most of the projects that my students in the CTO program are working on, the majority of them are machine learning focused. And maybe they're dabbling with generative AI as a user interface, a better way to reason over an existing database environment that's been with us since the 90s. So we always tend to overestimate how quickly things will change in the near term, and we underestimate how profound the changes will be over the medium and long term. I didn't come up with that. That's a well-worn kind of axiomatic thing, and we're in the middle of that now. So that's the other part of this is it's not just the chips, it's not just the models. If we were to somehow stop development on models and hardware today, we probably have a decade ahead of us sorting out the best use cases. and unlocking the value of what's already been built, let alone what's in the queue.
Yeah, so I mean, the MIT paper, that's like all I'm hearing about, all I'm seeing on LinkedIn. It took a few days for them to request my access to the research material, so I was a bit delayed in completing my read of it. The methodology problems aside, as I read this paper, I think, well, okay, 95% of generative AI enterprise pilots fail, as in fail, do not impact P&L. And then I
Right.
kind of think about that and I turn it around in my head and I say, well, 100% of poorly conceived pilots fail. So does this just tell us that 95% of pilots in, current conditions are poorly conceived? That's kind of where I landed after reading the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I always tease people from MIT because, my affiliation with Wharton, that there's a reason why the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia and not Boston. But we'll set that aside for a minute and just assume that MIT's got its act together. The other thing is, look, we all know what's the business school admonition. Don't tell me about tools and technology until you tell me what business problem you're seeking to solve. What's the business problem you're seeking to solve? What new market are you seeking to enter? A lot of these POCs, a fair number of them, are driven by people who are saying, hey, look, these tools are so revolutionary. It's really important to put these tools in front of people so that their imagination is unlocked. I've argued this. Look, if I were to say, hey, Sean, guess what? You just inherited 10,000 acres of land. What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with that land? Well, if the only tool you've ever experienced in your life is a shovel, you might say, I don't know, Dave, I think I'll plant a couple of trees, maybe 4 or 5 trees. I'm like, whoa, hold on. Before you answer, I want to show you a 15-second video clip. And I show you a video clip with no sound of a Caterpillar D9 earth mover. I think that's a thing. And you recoil because you're not sure if it's some sort of dragon or if it's a machine. But what you know, and you don't even know how it operates, where the fuel goes in, what it eats. You've just witnessed this thing that's plowing roads. And it completely changes the possibilities for what you might do with this 10,000 acres of land that you are granted. Or, the frontier US era, pre-railroad. You're having a meeting with your board of directors in the small town and you're talking about how maybe you should invest in a horse-drawn cart so you can get your milk to the outskirts of town a few miles away. And there's this clanging noise outside that's really frustrating. You look outside, you see these two metal lines stretching off into the future. If someone were to simply tell you, hey, guys, the railroad's coming through, your market is going to expand in a way that you could not have previously imagined. I argue that it's important to expose people to tools even before they figure out the business problems they seek to solve. And a lot of people are adopting that. And a lot of that will lead to failed proof of value or proof of concepts because people haven't figured out what the business problem is. So I think that we're going to iterate. I would say if we did a longitudinal study, a longer term study of those very people who have had failures to implement AI for whatever they thought they were going to do today, I'll bet if you revisited them in 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, the majority of them will in fact be getting significant value because they will have figured out from their mistake what the limitations are.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are hitting the alarm based off of the findings of this one study. But I mean, at the same time, it also just helps us triangulate where we are on this adoption curve. Is there's a lot of pressure at the enterprise level to go do AI successfully. And, so this results in an exercise of figuring out how to do something before you identify why you need to do it at all. And so you see some confusion. Then it also kind of speaks to this idea that, sure, boosting individual productivity is very different than trying to bolt on Gen AI in like well-established, somewhat brittle enterprise workflows. Turns out it's hard to move from a point solution to a whole new system. I mean, who would have thought?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Just this morning in class, I suggested to the august group that was gathered that this MIT study should make us all sleep better at night to realize that, look, we're all in this together. We're all figuring it out. It would have been worse, frankly, for the folks that I'm engaged with if the study showed that every single one of these people is achieving massive ROI gains. Why? because then everyone else would be like, oh no, I am way, way behind. The reality is we're all sort of learning this stuff together. Look, there's a fundamental thing that most people don't understand. When we hear AI, most business people don't know the difference between generative AI, something being generated, and something being retrieved, and or the combination of that is retrieval augmented generation. It's one thing to have a model act like it's a clever person and come up with something that appears to be genius. It's another thing to retrieve data that must be word for word perfect. The legal industry is a great example. If I want a citation from a case, that's not a generative AI game. I don't want Sean Kinney's version of what the law says. I want Sean Kinney to read from the book what the law says. And a lot of people don't understand that. It's really, really important for people to understand that the leading edge of what we see in generative AI is not well suited for some back end business processes. And we don't know this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that is artificial general intelligence or super intelligence. No one knows what that is going to look like in terms of will there be a point a year or 5 years from now where you simply speak into a microphone and say, go access all of the data that exists in my Oracle environment and answer this question for me. And it will go out and it will do it with a level of certainty that you trust so much that you won't even go and validate afterwards that the answers are correct. We're nowhere near that. And I do want to say something that struck me this morning as I'm going through my kind of news feed. It's something that's bothered me for a long, long time. I think in the political realm, regardless of what your political ideology might be, I think we all accept that certain news outlets will report from the perspective that they support. So you're going to get certain news outlets who are happy about what Trump is doing, other news outlets that are not happy with what Trump is doing. What we sometimes forget in the tech sector is that the leaders of these biggest companies in tech, they're politicians. So when somebody quotes what Sam Altman says or what Jensen Huang says about something, as though it's a scientist observing the environment, no. Sam Altman has a multi-trillion dollar vested interest, as does Jensen Huang, in a certain direction being followed. So what we do from a regulation perspective, so H20 microprocessors, GPU technology from NVIDIA, how much the tax is on that, what the thresholds are on that. You might as well ask the CEO of McDonald's what they think about hamburgers. People wouldn't take that seriously, right? People would be like, yeah, take it with a grain of salt. He sells hamburgers. Always keep in mind what the person is selling that's talking about this, because I think we put a little bit too much stock in what the leaders of these companies talk about. I look at the Futurum Group, we try to get through the noise as much as we can in a polite way, but we're all guilty of this when we sort of report on what these leaders are saying. Make no mistake, they have a massive vested interest in all of this.
Well, and I'm going to be guilty of this by paraphrasing a Sam Altman quote here, but I do think that
Oh,
this
that's great.
kind of gets us back to you referenced the public good and the common defense and the role of AI and national level alignment around that. But I think it was from a piece in the Atlantic kind of Q3 last year timeline, but he said something to the effect that AGI should be the work of nation states, but nation states are not doing it, so the private sector is doing it.
Right.
I don't think that neatly applies to the ground truth in China, definitely doesn't apply in the US, maybe more so as things change. But I'm sitting here looking at America's AI action plan, came out a few months ago, right? And, page 27, this page intentionally left blank. To me, that's maybe where we should have written down, and these are the stakeholders, and these are the milestones, and this is what we intend to do over the next 18 months, over the next 3 years, over the next 5 years. But I mean, do you think if the administration's goal, if the private sector's goal is that the US is going to lead in AI, which is, broad across the board, we're going to lead in AI, should we be setting up something akin to a China style 5-year plan with, very specific milestones, very specific delineation of responsibility? Like, what's the right balance between that level of top down coordination and free market economics?
Yeah. Well, if you had asked 20-year-old Dave Nicholson the question, it would be very, very different than asking me that question at my age. My wife and I just dropped off our youngest at a college over the weekend. And I think that we really need to have a conversation that answers the question, what is the object of this game? I mean, we want to lead in AGI. Why? Why? What does that mean? What does leading in AGI do for me and my kids and you and the people that care about you and that you care about? What does it do for our country? Does it widen the divide between the people who can use tools and the people who don't know how to use those tools even more? Now, some people will complain about billionaires. Okay, fine. That's a natural outgrowth of technology. Archimedes, I think he said it was Archimedes, give me a lever large enough and I'll move the world. Well, this is one of those levers that can be big enough to move the world. Where are we going to move it? That's the clarity that we need. Going back to this idea of the Manhattan Project, and I have a lot of thoughts on this that I didn't put in that article, but we've asked ourselves many times, just because we can do something, does that mean we should? What does it mean to have work become so efficient that some jobs become irrelevant? Work isn't just about producing things. Work gives human beings a sense of purpose. It provides meaning. It doesn't just provide meals. So I think that page that's blank, and maybe there's a mission statement in there that I'm not familiar with, to be fair. But I think we need to come to sort of a consensus that, look, this is what we're going to do. This is why this is so important. Think about another public policy that's been debated over time: foreign policy, interventionism. If we're going to militarily get involved in something, what is the goal and what is our exit strategy and what does winning look like? So, what does winning look like if we dominate this thing called AGI? We all nod our heads like we all agree on what the definition of that is. What does winning look like? Does winning look like a very small group of us? Look, me and you, we're going to be just fine. It's not going to be so fine if we hollow out the middle of our society. That's not going to be fine at all. Universal basic income doesn't give people dignity. It might keep them from starving to death, but it's a recipe for societal disaster, in my opinion. So that's the big thing. Yes, absolutely, we need to have a game plan. And that is not a scientific thing. And that is not a business leader thing. That is not a Sam Altman or a Jensen Huang thing. That is at least from a US perspective, that is a consensus building that is reflected in our representative government. Hopefully I'm not being too idealistic about that, but we need to get to that point where we kind of agree that, okay, look, the end game here is that we want our lives to be better. We want to cure disease. We want the rising tide to truly lift all boats in a way, because it has to serve humanity. It can't replace us. So, bit of a soapbox philosophical thing there, but I think that that's really missing in what we're doing. We're trying to optimize for ROI right now. The R in ROI is return. And that is a broad umbrella that doesn't just include profit. That includes, I want to spend an extra day a week with my family. It includes, I want to have more resources that I can direct towards the things that I care about. It's not just about eking out more profit.
Yeah, the whole idea about whoever achieves AGI first retains some sort of durable strategic advantage over a long period of time. I don't know if I fully agree with the framing. I think it has more to do with diffusion of a breakthrough, right? So once something revolutionary happens in the AI space, it's not so much that it happened, it's okay. And now how many people can adopt this, how quickly? It's kind of like your comment about the guy that invented snowboarding never winning a X Games medal, but he created this, whole new category of sporting competition. But that's kind of where I think that there needs to be a little more focus, is not just how do you get to breakthrough, it's how do you get to breakthrough and then spread it far and wide in a way that's accretive to companies and to individuals, right?
Yeah. And that comment that I made was intended to be provocative. It is a bit of a call to action because I do believe that it's important to figure out private-public partnership. I do believe that this warrants that. I believe it is like a mission to the moon sort of imperative. And hey, if the mission to the moon was nothing about getting to the moon, but it was the tension between the USSR and the USA, fine. Same type of thing, enlisting our best and brightest minds, I think is critical. Similar to the outcome of the Manhattan Project, which was global proliferation of nuclear weapons. Many have argued that the existence of those weapons have prevented, at least until today, knock on wood, World War III. If you look at the deaths associated with war, starting like with World War I, over time, it's actually declined. It is a less violent, more peaceful world, despite what we see in the headlines. And so I think it's critical from a strategic perspective for us to at least have parity to offset China to the extent that you see them as an adversary. They haven't been as imperialistic as the rest of the world has been, frankly, if you study history. So, in a way, we're sort of projecting what we in the West have done onto our adversary. And we're assuming that, hey, if they have an advantage, they will crush us. In the age of nuclear weapons, I don't, actual kinetic weapons, I think as at least a defensive strategy, we need to have parity. Right now, it looks like we are leading in the semiconductor space. There's evidence of that. The stumble that DeepSeek had, allegedly, depending upon domestic GPUs. But there's a whole question there because, we know this sort of gray market or black market for NVIDIA GPUs making it into China exists. We know that for certain. But I think that's when I say that this war for dominance is critical because it will shape the future. We don't want to be at such a disadvantage that we no longer have the choice. We no longer have the luxury of choice around what we'll do with this technology. I don't want us to be forced into having to keep up with China in a way that lowers our standards of living in the West. I guess that's my concern. I'm hoping that we actually take advantage of this to improve our lives. I'm a bit of a science fiction buff. Hot tip for folks, by the way, regardless of what you think about Elon Musk, read the Culture series by Ian M. Banks. And all of a sudden, you'll realize that half of the stuff that he comes up with off of the top of his head is stuff that he read in people's science fiction books. There's no secret there. It's unbelievable. But the point is, in that science fiction series, it's a sort of utopian view of where AI and robotics can take us. And I just think it's really important we stay on top of that. We define it. Like you said, we need to have a mission statement and really define what we want out of this stuff. So I agree, bit hyperbolic to say, the winner of the game takes all at the end. But I think it's important that we not fall behind, that we maintain parity so we have that flexibility to do the right thing here.
Expand a little bit on that Manhattan Project framing. I mentioned diffusion or ability to drive diffusion of a technology as an advantage. You talked about proliferation of nuclear weapons after the Manhattan Project successfully, met its
Right.
technological goal. So, I mean, let's maybe talk about AI containment through that lens, right? After there was that wave of proliferation, there was this huge multilateral, global, decades-long effort at non-proliferation. So, like,
Right.
this is really the only technology, nuclear weapons, the only technology I can think of that was successfully contained. It's still a huge barrier to entry. There are fewer of them today than there were 20 years ago. It's still very expensive. The price point didn't plummet. So it was contained. So I'm not like an AI doomer, but there are very obvious pathways to massive socioeconomic change on the back of AI. So it seems like it would be prudent to have at least discussions about global containment strategies. I don't really see that happening, but I mean, where do you stand on this? Should that be a priority as well? Should we be talking about these development strategies and tempering them with containment strategies, or is that a bit too fatalistic of a sort of response? Where do you land on that?
I would say that so first of all, I think we would agree that a baseball sized chunk of plutonium is probably harder to get across a harder to get on an airplane and fly across the country and construct a nuclear weapon than a USB thumb drive with code on it that you can or something that you can email. So I think the idea of containment of even the hardware that's involved, it's a worthy goal, but I think, you go, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to strive for perfection. Now, everyone knows perfection is not attainable. So the best we can do is slow things down. And it looks like we have slowed China down by simply having export controls. And it's not just export controls on the latest Grace Blackwell fill in the blank. We have export controls on things that are produced based on intellectual property from the US. In other words, you can be in a foreign country and the United States comes in and says, we have a big enough stick to prevent you from sharing what you're building on these machines because some of the software that runs on that machine was developed in the United States, and we consider that to be sensitive and strategic. So we're doing all sorts of stuff to try to contain. What is it doing? It's causing friction. And that friction has definitely, I think most agree, slowed down China. And I think that's the best that we can hope for if we agree that the goal is slow them down. So there is an analogy, but I don't think that AI proliferation is something that we can manage like we did with nuclear weapons. What's the saying? A secret is either not good enough to keep or too good to keep. There's no such thing as a secret that actually can be completely contained. So we're going to see more and more situations like the one in the news recently that actually led back to a Japanese company, unclear like who is stealing secrets and providing them to whom. I think we're going to see more and more of that. There's a lot of intrigue that's going on. This is a Cold War. It's a Cold War. And hopefully there will be no cyber war that will develop out of this. The last thing we want to see is the use of AI to break through security so that our banking system can be shut down or our electrical grid can be shut down, things like that. Those should be considered acts of war. And at some point, that will trigger kinetic war. There's a book called Cyber War, and it's got to be at least a decade, maybe 10 or 15 years old. It predates this generation of AI, certainly. Worthwhile read. I want to say the first name, Richard, he was a former government guy. It's a great book. Cyber War is the book. The point is, all of data is being hoovered up right now and stored because it's anticipated that AI will allow us to crack through the security that is preventing us from getting into that information. We're doing it. China's doing it. So one of the big turning points will be AI smart enough to crack through any security. So now they have access to things that we don't want them to have access to. What will they do? I would suggest that it would be not very smart to come in and interfere with our electrical grid or something like that. That's the quickest way to a kinetic war, and nobody wants that. So the parallels are there, and I think that there's an intertwinement between the results of the Manhattan Project and the proliferation and containment of nuclear weapons. That's not just a footnote in history. That's part of this AI discussion, because I would argue that the last line of defense against the nefarious use of what's developed with AI, it's going to be those nuclear weapons themselves. We haven't solved anything from that perspective, but who knows, maybe it will be the nuclear weapons themselves developed now generations ago that will protect us from the worst of AI.
That is a very interesting thought. And that's Cyber War by Richard Clarke. You've been given us
Thank you, Richard Clarke. Yes.
some excellent
Yes.
reading recommendations during this conversation. But sensitive to your time, David, but I do want to kind of reach a bit of a conclusion here. I think you've
Yeah.
given us a great point of view in terms of how you're going to answer this question. But what's the answer? Is AI worthy of a Manhattan Project-like effort? And if I could append to that, what do you think that your students who are going to be this next generation of technology leaders, how would they answer that question?
I think that most of them are focused on kind of keeping their eyes focused on the shorter term, adopting what we refer to as the CTO mindset. The idea that the role of CTO mindset, which can exist in the mind of a CEO or CIO or CTO or any business leader, it's the idea that part of your responsibility is to leverage the best of technology in service of the mission of your organization. Different organizations have different missions. It can be driving profitability, driving down cost, producing more goodness in the world. Whatever the mission is, leverage the best the technology has to offer. And they have to balance, we call it ambidextrous management, running the business, changing the business, keep the lights on, innovate. So a lot of them are really focused on that. What are the things under the umbrella of AI that I should be drawing upon? And if you took a snapshot today, still 70 or 80% of the value is coming out of machine learning. I think I mentioned earlier that the generative AI part is often, let's put an interface in front of this stuff that machine learning has been doing for us for a while. And then let's explore what's next with generative AI. The question of how do we open up retrieval of our proprietary data to unlock its value? Is it a good idea to unlock that data so that a model can reason over it? How do we do that? Do we fine tune the model? Do we actually train the model? Or do we give it ethereal access so then when it needs access, it has it, but nothing fundamental is permanently changing about the model itself? Those are kind of the current existential questions that these professionals are working on. So the students in the programs that I'm a part of are very senior technology leaders, CIOs, CTOs, CEOs, who are trying to sort through this question in the near term as a practical matter in their professional lives. We do then have the philosophical conversation. We take a step back, and there are varied opinions on whether private industry should be left completely unencumbered by government as much as possible, acknowledging that there's no such thing, that we have a mixed environment and have forever. We have regulations. In economic terms, there's this thing called an externality, right? So if you have a paper mill and you're making paper and people love your paper and you're dumping sludge and pulp into the river and killing the ecosystem and you don't pay anything for that, and the government doesn't say, no, you must do things in a more expensive way and then pass the cost on to consumers. So the externalities associated with AI are really hard to figure out. It's like, okay, OpenAI, you sell a subscription for $200 a month. How much societal damage is that doing? How do we account for that externality when it's not a physical thing like dumping sludge into a river? How do you account for those things? So the leaders in the programs that I'm a part of are thoughtful about that, and they think about it in terms of their family and friends and society. But there is no consensus on the answer. I will tell you that. I believe that, yes, we need an Apollo-like, Manhattan Project-like attention to this. I tend to lean in the direction of, I like that this money that's going to Intel carries with it equity in the pockets of the US, as opposed to the social gerrymandering strings that were associated with the CHIPS Act in the past. I'm not naive. We haven't gone from bad to good, but I like the transparency where it's like, look, here's the money. We now own part of you. At least I feel that that's more transparent. So, short answer, yes, we need to rotate in the direction of public-private partnership. It's okay to acknowledge that China has done a pretty good job of keeping a hands-off approach enough to not stifle innovation. Maybe they need to rotate even further away. I think we need to rotate more closely.
Yeah, I mean, finding the right balance and carefully walking that narrow middle path, it's tricky. It's historically tricky. It's playing out as something that's difficult to do today, but it's a big, important, and really engaging conversation, David, and I appreciate you taking the time to help us differentiate the signal from the noise as it relates to AI.
Sean, it's been a pleasure. I love talking to you, man. Good stuff.